Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete Kinich guide. In today's video, we're going to talk about Kinich, the newest 5-star Dendro DPS in Genshin Impact to release on the second half of version 5.0, and he's a character who I've been really enjoying, and so we're going to talk about everything you need to know about Kinich, his best builds, weapons, artifacts, team comps, constellations, playstyle, as well as a complete C0 showcase in the Spiral Abyss. Before we begin though, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's talk about Kinich. Alright, now starting things off, let's talk about what Kinich actually does and how to play him. Well, first of all, Kinich's kit revolves around his elemental skill, Canopy Hunter. This ability is a very unique one where Kinich will fire off a grappling hook, latching onto a nearby enemy, and then being able to spin around them in whichever direction you choose. Obviously, you can control where you're going, and as you spin, when you use a normal attack, you will fire off loop shots, effectively just shooting at the target you're grappled onto, dealing Night Soul aligned Dendro damage that is considered elemental skill damage. Also, inside of Kinich's elemental skill, you'll gain increased resistance interruption, which is nice to prevent you from randomly getting knocked out of your grappling hook. With that in mind, some big attacks can still knock you out of it, but note that you have a bit of resistance interruption, which is a nice bonus. And your skill has a 20-second cooldown with a 10-second uptime, although it is possible to extend it, as we'll see shortly. Additionally, worth noting that if there are no enemies nearby and you use your skill, mostly for exploration, you will grapple and swing forward, which is pretty cool, but obviously not relevant for combat stuff. Now, a few things to understand about this ability are that 1, you are inside of the Night Soul state when you do it. When you enter your skill, Kinich will enter the Night Soul Blessing state, lasting for 10 seconds, and also generating Night Soul points in a few different ways that I'll cover shortly. Once you reach your max amount of 20 Night Soul points, you can then fire a special cannon shot alongside your typical normal ones that will have a honestly crazy scaling. It will be your main source of damage, firing off a cannon shot at whatever enemy you're grappled onto, while also having a little bit of AoE if the enemies are really close by. This is something that you absolutely want to maximize, and you will be able to fire off the shot by repressing your skill once your Night Soul points are maxed. Now, in order to generate Night Soul points on Kinich, there's a few ways of doing it. Firstly, you'll get some just passively, in fact gaining 2 Night Soul points per second, and you will also gain 3 Night Soul points anytime you fire off your normal attacks and hit an enemy with your loop shots. Outside of just that though, there are 2 other ways. First of all, Kinich has a passive giving him 7 Night Soul points up to once every 0.8 seconds when your skill deals damage to an enemy who's affected by burning or burgeon. Because of this, Kinich will naturally have much better synergy alongside at least a pyro character to trigger burning or burgeon, allowing you to get much more Night Soul points and therefore get more cannon shots out inside of your skill's duration. Outside of just that, there will also be zones that light up as you are in your elemental skill. As you can see, as I'm riding around on Kinich, a field on the ground that's kind of glowing green will appear, and if you go inside of that, you will gain some Night Soul points, 4 to be exact. While you're grappling on an enemy, you will see these light up, notably after firing off a cannon shot. A new zone will light up, you'll try to ride towards it, and then you will gain more Night Soul points that way, allowing you to get Night Soul points from a few different sources, and once you've maxed it out, you will be able to repress your skill, effectively making it to where you grapple onto an enemy, you spin around, fire normal shots, and then every time your Night Soul points cap out, which you can get through multiple sources as mentioned, notably just by riding into the sectors and getting a big bonus if you're also running burning or burgeon, and then spamming your special charge shot as much as you can by repressing your skill whenever it's available. Other things to note about your skill spike or cannon shot is that after you use it, Kinich tries to grapple to the target, and also you can press or hold it by pressing or holding down your E key, and if you hold it, you can aim it better, but usually it's kind of a waste of time because you're only in the Night Soul state for so long, so you don't really want to waste more time unless you really need to aim, in which case it can be nice. This ability is really the main source of your damage, and everything you're doing inside of it, both the little normal attacks and then also your big skill press, will all be considered skill damage. Moving on, for Kinich's elemental burst, this will be a decent hit of AoE Dendro damage, summoning Ajaw or Ahau, his little dragon pet friend, to deal AoE Night Soul aligned Dendro damage passively as you're doing your own thing. Additionally, a very important property of this elemental burst is that it also extends your Kinich's Night Soul blessing duration by 1.7 seconds if he's inside of the Night Soul blessing. This means that if you use your skill and then your burst animation won't eat away at your skill's uptime because it kind of gives it back by extending your duration while also allowing you to gain more Night Soul points because you can generate them while the animation is playing. In fact, in your burst animation window, you can gain Night Soul points passively while also helping you trigger your passive more often, allowing you to get another Night Soul points when you hit a burning enemy, making your burst efficient to use inside of your skill instead of having to use it before or after and being worried that you're eating away at your uptime. With that in mind, your burst isn't the most important part of your kit. Kinich's main damage comes from his skill, so you don't have to focus on your burst that much. You're not really building around it, but you should use it whenever you have it, not only to help you get get some more Night Soul points, but also and especially because its AoE is quite nice and definitely bigger than your skill's AoE, helping you in multi-target situations. This is an ability with a 15-second duration and an 18-second cooldown with an energy cost of 70, and as we'll see later, it's okay if you don't have your burst up all the time because of how much of his damage comes from his skill, which is what you should be focused on building around, although his burst is nice to have as well. If all that wasn't enough, Kinich also has a second passive talent that will increase his skill damage from time to time. In fact, whenever a party member triggers a Night Soul burst, Kinich gains 1 stack of Hunter's experience. It lasts for 15 seconds and it stacks up to 2 times, and then when you use your skill's cannon shot, it will consume your stacks and increase your cannon shot's damage by a pretty big amount, with each stack increasing it by 320% of Kinich's attack, which again is honestly quite a lot. Now, the way Night Soul bursts are triggered and the frequency at which they are depends on how many different Natlan characters you're running in your team, basically making it to where Kinich will synergize a bit better with having other Natlan characters in his team, but for the most part, it's just a bonus amount of damage that will make some of your cannon shots deal quite a bit more damage by having a bigger scaling. Now, before moving on, for Kinich's talent priority, you should know that his skill is the most important, so level his elemental skill and then level his burst, and you can ignore his normal attacks. Additionally, to clarify, because I saw people confused about how Mwalani's damage kinda works, Kinich's damage in his skill is all considered skill damage, even though the shots of his little cannon thing, the animations are considered normal attacks for the purpose of support characters like Xingqiu or Yelan, but not someone like Beidou, who requires your normal attacks to do damage. The damage you deal is skill damage and scales with your skill's talent level, which is why you'd want to level that and build around skill damage buffs and not care about normal attack damage. Alright, now moving on, for a bit more advice on Kinich's playstyle and combo stuff, here's what you need to know. As mentioned, he's a character who revolves around his skill, and you will just be spinning around as you're grappled onto an enemy. What you want to make sure you do is obviously set up your support character's abilities, do everything you have to do before swapping into Kinich, then swap into him, use his skill, and then if you have his burst available, you can use it inside of his skill because it will extend the duration, and also you can gain Night Soul points inside of its animation while also giving you more damage. So a worthwhile ability to use if you have it, and then start firing your shots, spinning away, mashing your normal attacks, and then using your skill whenever you can to fire a cannon shot. Make sure you are triggering Burning or Burgeon if possible. Most of Kinich's teams will have at least Burning in it, and also try to go into the lit up sectors, the flashing green zones, which will appear as you're in your skill. You get one when you grapple onto a target, and then you'll get another one after every cannon shot, and you should try to path towards it. Additionally, keep in mind that Bennett is one of Kinich's best supports, as we'll see in the team section, and so staying inside of his circle while also trying to go into the lit up zones can be somewhat annoying, but something I want to emphasize is that Bennett's buff does linger for a while, even if you have to leave the circle for a second or so, meaning that you will typically be able to go into your lit up sectors, get your Night Soul points, and then return to the circle without really losing any buff uptime, so don't worry about it too much, as long as you're staying buffed for your big cannon shots. Oh, and also a tip I wanted to mention if you're playing Xiangling is that you can swing with Kinich in the opposite direction that your Pyronado is spinning, so counterclockwise, to help get more Pyronado hits off. It's a small thing, but worth mentioning somewhere in the video, although you should still prioritize going to the lit up zones when choosing in which direction to swing. Another big tip I can give is to make sure you are buffing your Kinich as much as possible through your other characters. Now, obviously this means running strong buffers, but it also means running something like the Deepwood Memory set somewhere in your team to reduce the Dendro resistance of opponents, and also in the future the hero set if we get a pyro character or just someone from Natlan who can use it efficiently. Now, as of right now though, I want to emphasize that the Deepwood Memory set is very strong, and you want someone other than Kinich to be using it, generally speaking. This could be a second Dendro character, but it could also be, and oftentimes it will be, just a generic off-field support who's dealing damage consistently from off-field and who can run this set to buff your team. This could be someone like Dea, Zhongli, or even a Xiangling who, yes, will lose out on damage, but the buff that you're giving your team will be so high that making sure you have Deepwood on just any generic support, preferably one that's not really dealing too much damage and is there to support and buff your team, is really important for Kinich to increase his damage quite significantly. And typically, as a generic rotation, you could do 2 normal attacks and then a skill, usually 4 times inside of your skill, provided you're triggering Burning or Burgeon, and you go into the lit up zones that appear. This will allow you to do 4 and 2 E's in a standard rotation. And also be sure to just use your skill whenever you can, your cannon shot that is, as for example, if you use your burst and in its animation you're gaining Night Soul points, and then you notice that right after your burst your skill's ready, use it and then go back to the 2 normals into a skill, which will let you get another cannon shot available. Just use your cannon whenever you have it. Very straightforward. Try to go into the sectors and you don't have to think too much about it. He's not as complicated as he may seem. Now, power level wise for Kinich, I want to say that he's someone who I have been impressed by. Now, I will say, very honest disclaimer, I think he's someone who will get better as future characters are released, especially because he's in the first patch of a new region, and I think that both Kinich and Molani will get better with future Natlan support characters, and probably the Pyro Archon, who I assume will be an off-field Pyro character that may synergize very well with his kit. Even if not though, new Natlan support characters will be able to run the hero set, the new Natlan support set, which is absolutely broken, and as of right now, basically no one, unless you're playing a support Molani, can run the hero set with Kinich because you need a support character from Natlan who can trigger a Dendro reaction in order to grant Kinich 40% Dendro damage bonus while also buffing any other elements involved in the reaction. This set is therefore insanely broken, and obviously as of right now, someone like Kachina, who's Geo, can't trigger the Mossy Rock reaction. There's no Geo Dendro reaction, so Kinich can't benefit from the set, kind of hinting at the fact that a future Pyro or even Hydro support may help trigger this set for Kinich, buffing him and other party members because of how broken the set is. Obviously, you could run someone not from Natlan on this set, but then you'd only get 12% damage bonus instead of 40. Additionally, Kinich, while he has some good synergy with certain characters, as we'll cover in the team section later, he doesn't have the best synergy with that many characters, so I think his teams definitely have room for improvement, which we will see in future patches. Also having good room for vertical investment, having a good signature weapon, a good first two constellations, and also being just a solid hyper carry, a solid C0 Dendro carry, even at a baseline. I will say that he's a character who does have a form of skill expression. You kind of need to know what you're doing, where you're going, and his playstyle definitely isn't for everyone. I find him very fun, and he definitely has a unique mechanic, a unique way of being played, but if it's something that you're not into, you don't feel like grappling and spinning around, then he may not be for you. Damage-wise though, he is very good. His main drawback is that a lot of his damage is not the most AoE, like he's not fully single target, although he does excel at shredding down a boss, but his AoE is somewhat small. Damage-wise though, he is very strong, and I do think he's completely different from other Dendro characters like Alhaitham, who will revolve more around the Quicken and Hyper Bloom reactions, whereas someone like Kinich revolves around burning, which is really cool and unique. Overall, I'm very happy with Kinich. I don't think he's game-breaking, but I do think he's very strong. He's one of the better DPS characters without being like the most broken. So a strong character if you want a new DPS, who I think will definitely get better as future supports are released for him, but not someone who you should feel forced to get. So not a must pull, but a strong character. All right, now moving on, let's talk about how you actually want to build your Kinich. Firstly, for your artifact sets, it's very straightforward. The Obsidian Codex, the new Natlan set, will just give you so many stats that it's going to be your best in slot on Kinich, and what I recommend all of the time. It'll give you 15% damage bonus on the 2-piece, and then 40% crit rate on the 4-piece set, effectively for free, just as you're consuming Night Soul points, which Kinich will be doing all of the time inside of his skill. 40 crit rate and 15% damage is a lot, making this set your best in slot and what I recommend. If you don't have a good Obsidian Codex set though, because it's new, there are viable alternatives that you can use. Firstly, the Unfinished Reverie set is great if you're burning, giving you 50% damage bonus and also some attack. This is typically going to be your second best in slot if you don't have an Obsidian Codex set and have farmed this instead. Alternatively, if you're running Kinich with Farina, the Marechaussee Hunter set is viable as well for 36% crit rate, although keep in mind that the 2-piece's normal attack damage buff is not very useful on Kinich, so you lose some value there. Outside of that, running the Golden Troop set for some skill damage, or mix and matching 2-piece sets can work as well for the time being until you farm for a better set. Additionally, regarding the Deepwood Memory set, this is an amazing supportive set that you should run with a Dendro carry, but I would recommend running it on a support character, someone else in your team that isn't Kinich, so that he can benefit from a set that gives him a ton of damage. Generally though, while he has decent alternatives, the Obsidian Codex is definitely what you should go for, as it's really just a broken set, giving you 40 crit rate and 15% damage bonus. Now for the stats you're looking for in Kinich, once again, very easy and straightforward. For your main stats, you're looking for attack percent on your Sands, Dendro damage bonus on your Goblet, and crit on your Circlet. While both crit rate and crit damage are fine, typically, crit damage is going to be more generally needed because you gain so much crit rate from the Obsidian Codex set, 40% to be exact, and you may also have a crit rate weapon like his signature. With that in mind, if you still need more crit rate, then a crit rate Circlet is perfectly viable. Just be mindful that you are gaining a lot from his set, and so crit damage may be more needed for you. Overall though, just try to have a good ratio, with attack, Dendro, and crit being what you're looking for. For your substats, look for crit damage, crit rate, and attack percent on every piece. And regarding the other stats, while Elemental Mastery isn't completely useless, it's not nearly as good as attack, even if you are burning. And regarding energy recharge, for Kinich, while his burst is nice, it's not the majority of his damage. Most of it comes from his skill, as we saw earlier, and so while having a bit here and there is nice, it's useful, it definitely isn't needed, and you should just use your burst whenever you have it, instead of trying to build for it and forcing out a burst every rotation. Realistically though, a bit of ER can be cool, but focusing on crit and attack is generally the way to go. Moving on, let's talk about Kinich's best weapons for every type of player. Well, first of all, Kinich's signature weapon is quite strong. This weapon has a really high base attack of 741 and also gives you some crit rate. Now, it's not the most crit rate, it's only 11, but that paired with the big attack you're gaining and effectively 60% damage bonus to your skill and ult through its effect makes it your strongest option by a decent amount. To be more exact, the damage bonus will stack up as you deal elemental skill damage to opponents affected by burning or burgeon, which you will basically always have in a Kinich team anyways. So on top of just having good base stats, it will also give you a 60% damage bonus to your skill and burst, which makes it a very good option and definitely your best in slot by a decent amount. Also, I feel like it's worth mentioning somewhere in this video that regarding this signature weapon, while it's great on Kinich and actually about a 25 to 30% damage increase over his free-to-play option, which is still good, and Kinich does have good alternatives if you don't get a signature, so don't worry. I want to mention that it's a weapon that obviously is tailor-made for him, but to an extent where it's recommendable for Kinich, but not as much for a generic stat stick if you're just looking for a good claymore overall. While it's great for Kinich, as mentioned, the fact that it has a really high base attack and only offers 11 crit rate means that the stat line is really only good for attack scaling characters, and then on top of that, its effect giving you a large amount of damage bonus to your skill and burst is really good, but also locked behind the burning or burgeon reaction, which is perfectly fine for Kinich or some other claymores like Dea, but in other cases may just be unachievable. As a weapon for Kinich, it is great, but if you're just looking for a generic claymore on your account, then it's much less recommended than some other characters' signatures. With that said, if you don't have the Mountain King's Fang, there's also some really solid alternatives like other 5 stars and even a really good free-to-play option. In fact, the Earth Shaker, which is the new Natlan blacksmith craftable weapon that you could get one copy of through a web event, but can also get more and refine it for free, provided you have the new prototypes, is a really good free-to-play option for Kinich and one of his best weapons overall. This is because the weapon gives you a lot of attack and also has an effect that will increase your elemental skill damage, which is the main part of Kinich's damage. For those reasons, the stats you gain on this weapon are just very efficient and makes it a really solid free-to-play option that you can use as a really solid stat stick. Now, with that in mind, other weapons can be better. First of all, other 5-star weapons outside of just his signature, which obviously is the best, can be quite strong, like notably Beacon of the Red Sea for a lot of crit rate and also a ton of attack percent on the effect, even more so if you take damage through things like burning or just the enemies you're fighting, but even without that, it's still a solid stat stick. Red Horn for a bunch of crit damage, or Verdict for attack and crit rate. All of these weapons can be solid 5-star stat sticks, and as you will see in the coming weapon ranking, they work quite nicely if you already have them, but aren't anything like too crazy, as even the free-to-play option for Kinich is quite strong. Outside of just that, you can also use other 5-star stat sticks like Wolves or Unforged for just a lot of attack, or even Serpent Spine as a solid battle pass option. Now, Serpent Spine is a weapon that can be more or less consistent with Kinich. It's a weapon that gives you a ton of stats, you get a lot of crit rate, and get a huge amount of damage bonus on its effect, up to 36% when fully stacked at R1 and 50% at R5, which obviously seems insane. Now, the problem with Kinich, however, is that it can be difficult to keep high stack uptime, especially because 1, you're spinning around all the time, so sometimes dodging certain attacks can be a bit difficult, unless you're shielded, of course, and 2, you may take self-damage if you're too close to enemies by the burning or burgeon reactions that you're triggering. It's possible to take self-damage from those reactions and from enemies that hit you, which would make you lose stacks and therefore lose damage. For the most part though, it is a very efficient weapon at giving you a lot of different stats, notably crit rate and damage bonus, but you do have to be mindful of how you're playing, and you can do things such as running a shield character to prevent losing stacks, or just trying to stay far away from enemies, avoiding self-damage and just avoiding their hits as a whole to make the most out of this weapon. Overall though, you shouldn't have a big issue maintaining high stacks on Serpent Spine, and if you can do so, it is a very good weapon and definitely one of your best overall. Another thing to keep in mind with any crit rate weapon that I mentioned is that because you're running the Obsidian set that gives you a lot of crit rate, if you're also running a crit rate weapon, you want to make sure that you take this into account when you're building your artifacts, balancing your ratio to make sure you're not overcapping on crit rate. For the most part though, these are all the solid, strong options that Kinich has, and almost every other option, notably a lot of other 4-star stat sticks, are viable, but generally worse than the new free-to-play option, the Earth Shaker, that is such a solid free-to-play stat stick, it makes other weapons just pale in comparison. As mentioned though, other generic 4 stars can work, provided they give you crit or attack, as you will see in the weapon ranking that we're about to get into. In fact, now I'm going to put a weapon ranking on screen showing you Kinich's different weapons and how good they perform under specific assumptions. Keep in mind that this is just a general ranking, and it will vary heavily based on your team, your rotation, your artifacts, what you're fighting, and just a lot of other factors, so keep that in mind as a lot of assumptions go into a weapon ranking, but this should give you a general idea as to how good each weapon is. As you can see though, his signature weapon is definitely a solid option, but Serpent Spine, if you can avoid taking burning damage and enemy damage, can also be quite good. So can other 5-star stat sticks, and even the Earth Shaker is a really solid free-to-play option. Even though it's not as good as his signature, it really is just a solid baseline craftable that anyone can get. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Kinich's Constellations and how good they are. Well, firstly, I will say that while Kinich is a great character at C0, so don't feel forced to get any Constellations, he has some really good early stopping points, with both his C1 and C2 being surprisingly good. Firstly, for Kinich's C1, he will gain a 100% crit damage increase for his Scale Spiker Cannon. This is the big shot on your skill, and it's not only the majority of your damage, but it's also your biggest AoE, and so getting more crit damage on the biggest part of your damage is definitely really nice, and will usually be around a 25% personal DPS increase, which is good for a C1. Additionally, you get some movement speed when you are exploring, and use your skill as a grapple, so that's a nice quality of life upgrade. Overall though, a solid C1 that is very straightforward. Moving on, for Kinich's second constellation, here you will gain a mini Deepwood memory set, decreasing the dendro resistance of opponents by 30% when they're hit by his elemental skill. Additionally, his first cannon shot inside of his skill will have increased AoE and a 100% damage increase, which is obviously very nice. Decreasing the dendro res of enemies will make you have just more damage overall, and might also buff another dendro party member you may be running, while also having one stronger cannon shot that has a bigger AoE. And this C2 is a similar damage increase, actually a little bit more than your C1, around 25 to just under 30%, which honestly makes it a pretty impressive C2, although again, it's not a needed one. Moving on, your C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, with C3 increasing your skills level, which is definitely the nicer one. Your C4 will give you some more passive energy, while also making your burst stronger, making it deal 70% more damage, and just making it a stronger ability to use overall, but it's still not the most impactful constellation when compared to your first three constellations that make your skills cannon shots hit like a truck. And lastly, Kinich's C6 will give him a huge buff to his cannon shots, making them bounce for an additional 700% attack scaling, bouncing between opponents once, with this bouncing attack also keeping any buffs that may have been triggered from your passive talents. Overall, it's just a big chunk of damage that I believe should also work, from what I've heard, against a single target enemy, as it will just bounce on the same opponent, but overall it's just a lot more front-loaded damage to your elemental skill. For the most part, Kinich has pretty good constellations, nothing that you should feel like you need to get, but as far as vertical investment goes, Kinich has a really solid C1 and a really solid C2, so do with that as you will. And if you're wondering whether you should choose your signature weapon or your first constellation, C1 versus R1, here it really depends on what you have. If you have already a strong 5-star option for Kinich, then I would choose his C1, as the damage increase can be comparable while also giving you quality of life for exploring. If you're running his free-to-play option, however, then getting his signature will typically be a bit higher of a DPS increase than his first constellation, and it's a claymore that you could potentially use on other characters, making it more flexible, but you do lose out on the quality of life, exploration-wise at least, that his first constellation has, so it's whichever you value more. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about one of the most important sections, Kinich's best teams and synergies. Now, for the most part, Kinich will be ran with the Burning or Burgeon reactions. As mentioned, he's kind of the opposite of Alhaitham in that way, where instead of being ran as the traditional Dendro DPS alongside Hyperbloom or Spread, you are being ran with Burning and Burgeon, which I think is very unique. As of right now, while Kinich definitely doesn't have the most flexible teams, he has quite a few different options that will help him by either giving him huge buffs or by having a solid amount of off-field damage and elemental application. In that sense, here are the teams and supports that you can run with him. Firstly, Bennett is a premier damage buffer to anyone who scales with attack. Kinich is no exception here, as he's an attack scaling hypercarry who can benefit greatly from Bennett's field that provides him with a huge attack buff. Additionally, you can run a supportive set on Bennett, and he's also a pyro character that can help you trigger burning and also be the healer for your team. While staying inside of Bennett's circle can be annoying while you're swinging around on Kinich, it usually isn't that hard, and you can, for the most part, stay buffed all of the time because of how Bennett's buff lingers, so even if you have to leave the field very briefly, it shouldn't be the end of the world. Playing Circle Impact is a bit annoying sometimes, but I think it's really worth it and kinda overhated, so he's usually your go-to healer. Outside of just Bennett, in a burning team in particular, Emily is a very strong support or sub DPS. While she doesn't have any inherent buffs in her kit, at least at C0, she's a character who has a really good amount of off-field dendro damage when played in a burning team. Because Kinich also wants burning, it's a no-brainer that Emily synergizes well with him because she has a ton of off-field damage, but it will also help support your Kinich by giving him a lot of dendro particles, allowing him to burst more often, and also being someone who can run the Deepwood memory set if no one else in your team is running it. I will point out though that even in this Emily Shangling team, while you can run Deepwood on Emily, it can actually sometimes be better for your team's damage to give Deepwood still to Shangling, which is kind of awkward, but yeah. And worth noting that because the last slot in this team is flexible, someone who I also really like is actually Dea as your second pyro, who will apply enough pyro for you to get burning consistently, while also allowing you to get shorter rotations, assuming you're running her on the Sack Greatsword and proccing it reliably, which can actually matter in practice. So definitely a great option that has surprised me is running Dea in a burning team. Now with that in mind, I don't think Emily is a must for for Kinich. Like, obviously, if you have her, you should run them together because they both do a lot of damage in a burning team, but Emily's someone who kind of does just that. She'll deal a lot of damage, but isn't someone who Kinich depends on, and there are viable alternatives as well. In fact, in a burning team, you can kind of run whatever, provided you are triggering enough burning. Outside of that, anyone that buffs your Kinich is going to do just fine. Kinich can be ran as the solo Dendro option here. You can run just generic good characters like Xiangling and Farina, or honestly Farina and a flex slot, and it can work quite nice. Farina is one of Kinich's best supports as well, performing similarly to Emily and sometimes even better because she gives you such big damage buffs while also having good personal damage as well. While Farina is obviously used in like every team, Kinich is no exception, and as long as you have a healer who can help your Farina gain stacks, she works very nicely. It is worth pointing out that while Bennett isn't the most efficient at healing your whole team, if you build him well, give him enough healing stats, you can get enough stacks for your Farina, provided you are swapping through your characters and know what you're doing. Outside of just Bennett though, you can run other more team-wide healers like Baiju if you don't want to run Bennett, although he's generally just the best option by quite a decent amount. In a team with Farina, you're also getting the occasional Burgeon. I wouldn't call it a straight up Burgeon team as you don't have the most Hydro application, but you will get some, and you can also run another Pyro character here like Xiangling or even Toma or Dea. Xiangling in particular is nice because she's such a strong unit, but keep in mind that in this particular team comp with Kinich, you generally will actually want to run her on the Deepwood memory set because of how important it is to have the set on someone in your team. While yes, you will lose out on personal damage on whoever's running it, the amount of damage you're gaining on your Kinich, who is the sort of hyper carry of the team, is definitely worth the sacrifice. For generic supports though, like Dea or Zhongli, who also can work very nicely in a Kinich team, using Deepwood is a no-brainer as you're not really losing out on anything. And so for a burning team, there's a lot you can do, with Kinich Emily Bennett or Kinich Farina Bennett being the two main go-to options. Now, if you want to run a second Dendro character outside of Emily, you can run someone like Baiju or Kirara if you want some shielding or defensive utility, but outside of that, there isn't really the best options, and running him as a solo Dendro can be perfectly fine. Regarding someone like Nahida, while she definitely can still work with Kinich, she really won't get as much value as with some other teams because other team comps can utilize her Elemental Mastery buff and also her really fast Dendro application a lot better than someone like Kinich can. Outside of just that, you can definitely run Kinich in a more Burgeon-oriented team where you'll run him with a fast Hydro applying support and a Pyro Burgeon trigger with a flexible last slot, oftentimes still being Bennett. You can run someone like Xingqiu or Yelan as your Hydro slot to apply a ton of Hydro from off field, firing off rain swords alongside your Kinich's skill shots, as while his normals inside of his skill are considered skill damage and not normal attack damage, they still are considered normal attacks as far as the animation goes, so you will trigger coordinated attacks such as Xingqiu's rain swords, which is really nice to know. Outside of that, you can run a generic Burgeon trigger like Toma, Dea, or Xiangling, and your last slot is very flexible. Now, before talking about other teams, here are some examples of different burning or Burgeon comps you can run on screen to help you maybe pick a party, but keep in mind that there's usually room for a flex slot depending on the team comp you're running. I'm doing this to help you guys get a party that you could use right away and also not feel like you need any specific unit like Emily or Farina if you don't have them and want to know alternatives. It is also worth pointing out that having grouping for Kinich's AoE is quite nice. It's not usually recommended to run a Nemo support because you can't swirl Dendro and the VV set won't buff you, so someone like Kazuha is not usually recommended, but it can still be viable if it's helping you buff another element like Pyro and aids you in grouping enemies for your Kinich to have better AoE. Obviously, it's not what I typically recommend, but I did want to mention it somewhere in this section. Additionally, if you pulled from Wolani and want to run her as a support instead of a DPS for some reason, I've been thinking that you actually can, because as of right now, no one else can really run the hero set with Kinich, and you can run Thrilling Tales and gain 40% Dendro damage bonus and 48% attack just through Wolani's artifacts and weapon, but obviously you shouldn't play Wolani as a support generally. That's not why you pulled for her, I think, but it's something that technically can work and I think is funny, so I wanted to mention it as well. Lastly, for some other teams you can play, naturally you can play Kinich in Hyperbloom because Hyperbloom is just such a good reaction. Now obviously Kinich loses out on some damage this way. You won't get as many cannon shots and therefore your personal damage will take a hit, but because Hyperbloom's so good and Kinich can be a on-field Dendro applier, a Dendro driver for the team who can enable Xingqiu and Yelan to fire off their rain swords through his normal attacks inside of his skill, even though they don't do normal attack damage, it still works. He can work perfectly fine in a Hyperbloom team and it can actually be surprisingly decent. Personally, I've also tested around with running a Pyro character as the last slot to get the occasional Burgeon and therefore give you more Nightsoul points and allow you to kind of Hyperbloom but also Burgeon from time to time, or run a Burgeon team with an Electro last slot like Fischl, so you're mostly Burgeoning but sometimes you get a Hyperbloom, and I think these are perfectly fine. They're viable teams and they can work for Kinich. I've enjoyed playing them, but keep in mind that your personal damage won't be as high if you are focusing on Hyperbloom. It'll be decent team damage but not as good Kinich damage, so less what this guide's about but still worth mentioning. Also wanted to mention that burning load or burning plus overload teams, where you're just putting an electro character alongside a burning team, can work as well. You'll have an electro character like Fischl who just does good damage, and you'll still get burning, and you'll also get the occasional overload and the occasional quicken, which can help for your damage, so it's nice. It's a viable team that can work if you want to play it. Lastly, for the other teams I didn't mention, like quicken, it's okay, but not what I recommend for Kinich, so I'm gonna just leave it at that. Alright, now with that said, we're gonna get into a DPS showcase of Kinich in the current floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. I'm gonna include clips of a few different teams, notably running either Emily, Farina, or Fischl. The Fischl team will have only 4-star supports, just so that you guys can see how Kinich performs in various teams without needing like a specific formula. Keep in mind that Virgin's also good, but the current Abyss is pretty single target, so that's why I'm using Burning. And my Kinich is going to be C0 with level 9 talents, the new Obsidian Codex set, while also running the Redhorn Stone Thresher. Now this weapon, as you saw in the weapon ranking earlier, is about as good, slightly better than his free-to-play option, so kind of comparable to 4 stars, nothing too amazing, as he can't make use of the effect, but it's still a nice stat stick that makes my ratio look even better despite the low attack, which Bennett helps with, having a total ratio of 90-315 if you factor in the extra 40 crit rate we get from Obsidian. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, overall Kinich is one of my favorite main DPS characters. I find him genuinely enjoyable and I think he's cool. Although, as I mentioned, I know his gameplay is not for everyone, so personally I have a lot of fun not just playing him, but also exploring with him as he's very mobile and a character that I like. Although admittedly, I've only been playing him on the Asia server. I'm waiting on my main account for my next live stream so I can actually pull. With that in mind, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If there's anything new, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that, as Kinich is a new character, so new things may be discovered. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the guide, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.